George Washington may have been indispensable to history, but was James Thomas Flexner's book, Washington, the Indispensable Man, indispensable to you? Morning, BookTube. Bill Ruttenberg here with the Ruttenberg Library, and I'm here on a very cold morning here in Iowa. Had a lot of snow. School's got a late start today, so I decided to get an early start on getting my very first book review out to you. The book that I'll be reviewing this morning is Washington, the Indispensable Man by James Thomas Flexner. This is supposed to be one of the classics of Washington historiography, from Back Bay Books, a Little Brown and Company publisher. It is the original copyright was 1969. I have the third printing from 1974. This was the first of my 12 books that I wanted to read this year for my goal, and so there's the front cover. And then so James Thomas Flexner was a writer born 1908. He passed away in 2003. He had graduated from Harvard University and then later became a historian and writer. He wrote several books on different patriots of this era. His first attempt at writing about George Washington was actually supposed to be a single volume right off the get-go. But Flexner found that as he did the research on Washington, there was a whole lot more to the man than what he originally thought. And he started off with that 4-volume set on Washington, and then later was asked to make that single volume, and this was his efforts at that single volume. Now, I will admit that I have not read the 4-volume set yet, so some of my comments in here may change once I've read the 4-volume set, but again, my comments are only going to be about the one single book. I'm going to do my rating on a 1 to 5 scale for these books. As the back had pointed out, again, Flexner won the Pulitzer for that 4-volume set. He also won a National Book Award, so it was well acclaimed. So I'm kind of excited to see what those 4 books are all about. But again, just doing this one. So tell you a little bit about what I liked about the book. I can definitely tell that Flexner has very thorough research. That is very evident. He shows that throughout. He gives a brief timeline of his entire life. Book covers a ton of territory. Now, that is good and bad. It's good because it's going to give the average reader, just little snippets of his entire life. But I felt that possibly that was not such a good thing, because those little snippets are not quite enough to totally understand the man George Washington. And again, just my opinion on that. I think he does an excellent job, an awesome job of making historical arguments. He gives his opinion with evidence to back it up. So, the title of the book, The Indispensable Man, that's kind of the running theme through the whole book. And he is going to prove it, kind of point by point as he goes through the book. And I'll read here in a minute a couple passages that kind of show that. He doesn't leave you guessing on where he stands on a historical argument. And I like that, because sometimes authors don't want to take a set stand, and you can't tell. They're kind of wishy-washy. You can't tell where they're at, and Flexner definitely does not do that. Throughout the book, one of the things I did like is it's got various maps and pictures throughout the book. I'm a picture guy, so when you're going through certain battles, he's got the maps that are helping you walk through that as he explains it. I always like the illustrations that are throughout the book. He's also got a section of some black and white photos. Maybe not the greatest of photos. I mean, because of them being black and white, It would be nice to see the color painting, but here's an example of that. So you got Peggy Shippen and Benedict Arnold there, and who else do we got? Lawrence? No, John Andre. Wow, that was off. Picture of John Andre. So anyway, I like the illustrations in the book. I always like to have some illustrations to help understand the story. I believe Flexner gives the reader the main idea of the book in the title. Like I said, he guides you through it. So let's go ahead and look at a few of those. So remember, the idea is he's the indispensable man. So he's got to set the stage for this. So early on, when he's looking at his career in the French and Indian War, he is definitely recognizing that Washington is not a perfect general. I think just about everybody, or not general, but officer. And I think everybody recognizes that. Washington made a ton of mistakes when he was young. He was learning through experience. He didn't have the classical schooling that most officers have. So, in this paragraph, or excuse me, chapter talking about 1755 to 1759, he thus enrolled in a school of experience that would in many ways prepare him for the world-shaking task he was to undertake almost 20 years later. So he's recognizing this, and then later on he says, yet subsequent actions reveal that down the years Washington mulled over his experiences in the French and Indian War, and his character and his worldview expanded. More meanings became clear to him. So again, he's learning as he goes. He accurately defined his failures and worked out the reasons why he had failed. The results of this protracted self-education were to prove of the greatest importance to the creation of the United States. Again, pointing at he becomes, when the revolution comes around, the indispensable man. Let's see. And then he gets into just some basic historical arguments about, William Howe at the Battle of New York. And should he have attacked, should he have not? And he talks, historians have long argued that Howe threw away a great opportunity by not attacking, while Washington's men were, despite his best efforts, still in great fear and confusion. The British commander, however, congratulated himself on his restraint. In common with his governmental superiors overseas, Howe believed that the rebellion had been fomented by a few desperate men who had terrorized the American majority, which still loved their sovereign. By making fools of these desperate men, as he had just done, Howe would encourage the well-disposed majority to brush them aside. And so, he's looking at these different arguments, or these different, discussions that are had on the Revolution. Was Howe in the right or wrong in not finishing off Washington? Here's another one. Masses of evidence brought forward at the time and in controversies subsequently staged by historians have obscured the truly basic issue. To what extent was Washington's new army able to stand up against the European regulars? On this issue, General Clinton gave his silent testimony by preferring, during the rest of his command, to fight where the Continental Army was not. So he's pointing at, Washington had learned some stuff, and he was in the right on what was going on. Next, look at how he treats Benedict Arnold, who is very easily the villain in many stories, but Flexner recognizes Arnold for what he is. When during the dark hours of the long, inconclusive war, Washington counted his assets. High on the list was a former scapegrace apothecary who had demonstrated genius at leading men at fighting. Benedict Arnold was, in fact, the greatest combat general in the war on either side. And so, despite his stupidity in treason, and when you get to studying that, you might kind of understand where he was going with his why he did his treason. But to me, it's never really acceptable. But anyway, I'm starting to digress. But he recognizes him for the fighting general that he is. He is by far the best general on either side. And he doesn't want to leave any doubt on that. I really liked a 3-paragraph area in the book where Flexner is pointing out where Washington, from the French and Indian War all the way to the present, or to the Revolution, he has really learned as he's went, and it's been through the school of hard knocks. You know, he's learned as he went. He didn't have that formal training, and so Flexner really, when we talk about an indispensable man, he really points at that lack of training is actually a good thing for him, because those British generals, they had been trained in classic military procedures, and time again, when they failed, they got fired. And they cannot adjust or adapt to the situation at hand, where Washington has learned to adjust and adapt, and that is what makes him the indispensable man. If he was set in stone on what to do, you know, with the military tactics, he would have never been successful. And Flexner does a great job of pointing that out. The size of this book is not intimidating. There's only about 402 pages of actual reading. The rest of it is sourcing, footnotes, that kind of stuff. I think the average American could handle the length. It's not, you know, it's not real thick. It's not a beast. Now let me tell you what I don't like about this book. It was written, I felt, in a very academic style, and it's going to speak over a lot of people's heads. When I look at a book and I try to think about whether I would recommend it or not, I think about my different audiences. I think about, would I recommend this to my middle school? Would I recommend it to my high school? Would I recommend it to a friend who's studying? Or, you know, I try to look at that. This is definitely not a book I'd recommend to a middle school or really even a high school student. They just plain and simple wouldn't read it. They probably wouldn't get out of the first chapter. It doesn't have that flow. With that being said, I do think it's very important to George Washington, to the historiography of the man, and I do believe that it would be very helpful to anyone studying Washington, because of the author's points of views and how he backs all of that up with fact. Because the subject matter was so broad, I felt that Flexner couldn't go into detail on anything. I felt that he either skipped or skimmed a lot of stuff when you're looking at his entire span of Washington's life, and it was almost like you got, yeah, it was kind of, you know how you get a skipping record, and that's almost how it read, especially early on, because you just get little snippets as you go, and it drives me nuts. And the other thing that really bugged me about Flexner, and when I think about recommending books, is the average American doesn't know what was going on at the time. So you got to really set the context, set the scene of the politics, the military, just Washington's social life and everything. And I don't know that Flexner did a real great job of that in this volume. Now, he may have done it in the 4-volume set, but not in the single volume. And that really bothered me. And my middle school, high school kids have to have the scene set, because they definitely will not have the background. The only exceptions to that were later in the book, when he's talking about the problems with the French while they were in the middle of the French Revolution, and then thinking about going to war with Great Britain, and then the problems that he had between Hamilton and Jefferson. I do think he did a very good job of setting the scene there and explaining the context of everything. So there's no mystery there. So I think he did a good job there. But most of the book, it was so much for that, like in the beginning of the book versus those couple chapters, it's almost like you're reading two different books, just because of the amount of detail that was put in, and that really bugged me for some reason. Being a huge fan of George Washington, I really only had one historical interpretation that I really disagreed with. I've read quite a bit about him. There was only one big thing that just really bothered me, and it's just an opinion. So at the end of the book, Flexner really hits on Washington in his old age. He really, I think, plays on that he was becoming senile, and that bothers me. I don't think Washington was going senile. I think he was old and set in his ways, and so when the United States started to adjust, as far as, you know, having political parties, which Washington hated, even though he was very one-sided with the Federalist Party, he tried to rise above all of the riffraff and the junk going on, And so when that split started happening with Hamilton, Jefferson, and then everybody that followed them, he did not understand that. He had troubles handling that. And I think that's just because he was set in his ways. At that point in his life, he couldn't adapt. He did really well militarily, but then politically, he struggled to adapt to the situation. And so I don't think it's because he's senile. I think he's set in his ways. But that's just a personal disagreement. So anyway, if I was to rate this book, my rating for this book, I would give it a 3 stars. I would recommend it, but I would not recommend it to middle school, high school. But I would recommend it to anybody who's doing in-depth studies on Washington, plain and simply because he's important to the historiography of Washington. I hope this video was helpful. If it was helpful, like it, please, and feel free to subscribe and share with others. Thank you.